Hey everybody, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be going over the 5 EV charging companies I think are in the best position today. Now, just because they're on this list doesn't necessarily mean I think they're a good investment. It just means they're one of the top 5, I think, in the EV charging industry. The first company on the list is ChargePoint, and their specialty is these level 2 AC chargers that are really designed for public use. So if you're a hotel or a store, for example, you would be purchasing a ChargePoint charger for your customers or your guests to be using during their time at your store or hotel. So that's pretty much the main customer base for ChargePoint's AC chargers. They do also have DC chargers. This is kind of a newer thing they've done. DC fast chargers are fundamentally much more expensive to build and install than these level 2 AC chargers. So a lot of those customers that would be buying these AC chargers, they're not necessarily the same people that are buying these DC fast chargers. There is some overlap, but probably the biggest customer for ChargePoint's DC fast chargers are fleet operators. Now, ChargePoint's business model involves selling that charging hardware itself. So ChargePoint does not own any of those chargers that are out there. They don't collect any revenue from the electricity that's sold. They simply sell the hardware. However, all of these chargers connect back to the ChargePoint network. So if you're the owner of one of these chargers, you've got to pay a subscription fee in order for your charger to continue being part of that ChargePoint network. So it's pretty much a mandatory thing if you want your charger to stay in use. You've got to pay this subscription fee. Moving on to ChargePoint's financials, I've got the balance sheet pulled up here. You'll see they've got a pretty decent amount of cash right now, but that has been recently boosted by the maturity of their short-term investments. They previously had $105 million of those. Their total assets are at just over $1 billion, and their total liabilities are at $732 million. So they've got a pretty solid book value of $327 million. Now, it is worth pointing out that that book value is being heavily supported by the amount of goodwill they've got, which is coming in at $216 million. So just keep that in mind when you're kind of looking at that large book value that ChargePoint has. A lot of it is coming from the goodwill. Looking at their income statement, you'll see ChargePoint's revenues have grown pretty substantially year over year, but alongside that comes these increasing costs as well. And I believe over the past couple of quarters, ChargePoint's margins haven't been doing very well. They've been deteriorating a bit. So keep an eye on that if you're going to be owning ChargePoint stock. Their gross profit was $30.5 million, which is fairly decent for some of these EV charging companies. But obviously, you know, we've got the research and development expenses here at almost $50 million, sales and marketing at $37 million, and general and administrative expenses at $24 million. So overall, ChargePoint's loss from operations was $79.9 million. So, you know, this is still not a profitable business. ChargePoint's market cap is just over $3 billion, and their stock has been declining over the past year. Their price to sales ratio is at 5.76, and their price to book is at 9.38. Moving on to the second company on the list, we've got Wallbox, and they're fairly similar to ChargePoint in a lot of respects. They don't own the chargers, they're simply selling the hardware, and similar to ChargePoint, they primarily specialize in these level 2 AC chargers. Now, unlike ChargePoint, Wallbox is a little more focused on home charging. ChargePoint does offer a home charger, but they're primarily focused on building public chargers, whereas Wallbox is a little more in between public and home chargers. Wallbox has also been getting into DC fast chargers more recently, just like ChargePoint. This is their Supernova unit. It can deliver up to 150 kilowatts of power. Eventually, I believe they plan to release a unit called Hypernova, which can deliver up to 400 kilowatts of power, which is more in line with ChargePoint's Express Plus DC fast charger. So overall, there are a lot of similarities between ChargePoint and Wallbox. Looking at Wallbox's balance sheet, you'll see their cash has declined over the past year. Their inventories have increased very dramatically over that year, very similar to what ChargePoint has been experiencing. And their property and equipment has also grown pretty substantially as well. Wallbox's total assets are at 422 million euros, and their total liabilities are at 253 million euros. And Wallbox's book value is at $169 million, which is fairly solid. They've had pretty good revenue growth over the past couple of years, but those costs have also been growing right alongside it. They've also got employee benefits expenses, other operating expenses, and amortization and depreciation, which have really dragged down their income. And they've got an operating loss of $138.8 million. So once again, this is still not a profitable company and probably won't become profitable for a while. Here on the cash flow statement, we can see where Wallbox has brought in new funding during this time period. There's 41.7 million euros of pipe financing, and they brought in 291.2 million euros from loans, although they did pay off 218.9 million euros worth of previous loans. Wallbox's market cap is just under $800 million, and like ChargePoint, their stock has been falling over the past year. Their price to sales is at 3.6, and price to book is at 3.7. So just based on these two metrics alone, Wallbox is a better deal than ChargePoint, but you got to keep in mind ChargePoint has a lot more cash on their balance sheet. Moving on to the third company of the list, we've got Tesla, and of course the charging is a pretty small portion of their overall business, but I still had to include them here since they are so dominant in the EV charging industry. In the past, all of Tesla's chargers were only compatible with Tesla vehicles using their own proprietary charging connector, but this is shifting now that they've started opening up that connector, trying to make it a standard in North America. And they've also even started adopting the CCS connector on some of their superchargers, although that's probably going to be a short-lived thing now that they're opening up their North American charging standard connector, as they're calling it now. But Tesla has always been known for their superchargers. Right now, these deliver up to 250 kilowatts of power, I believe, although their version 4 chargers can deliver a lot more. But they've also got these level 2 chargers that you can have at home. So this is a very popular option, especially for a lot of Tesla owners, of course, is to purchase one of these chargers for your home. But you can also have these for a business, similar to if you were buying ChargePoint chargers. Kind of the same sort of customers would probably be interested in some of Tesla's level 2 chargers. Now, Tesla's business model for their chargers is that they own all of their superchargers and generate revenue from the sale of the electricity. But for their level 2 chargers, they simply sell the hardware. So as far as I know, they don't own any of these level 2 chargers. They might own a very small amount, like they might have some at their showrooms, for example, but I don't think they own most of these level 2 chargers. I think these are pretty much all privately owned by the customers that are purchasing these. However, even if the charger is privately owned, it can still be listed on Tesla's charging map, since it is still part of the Tesla charging network. Although if it is a privately owned thing, like for a house, it's not going to be available for public use, so that won't be listed on Tesla's map. But if you're like a hotel or somebody, you can make it visible so EV drivers know it's there. Looking at Tesla's income statement, you'll see their total revenues have grown a fair amount from where they were a year ago, although their total cost of revenues have grown even more. So essentially, their gross margins have been declining over this past year. Their gross margin right now is around 19%, which is still pretty solid for an automaker, especially an EV automaker. I mean, these margins are still very good, even though they have declined over the past year. Now, if you're wondering where Tesla's charging business falls on this income statement, I'm pretty sure it's under services and other. Now, it's not the only thing included in this category. There's other things in there as well, but as far as I know, this is where all of that revenue is. And they brought in $1.8 billion from this category, and it cost them $1.7 billion. So that's about an 8% gross margin there. So it's, at least it's profitable, but it's not anything too crazy. Something else I think is worth mentioning is that their energy generation and storage business is now doing pretty well. They brought in $1.53 billion of revenue, and it cost them $1.36 billion. So it is currently profitable, I believe about a 12% gross margin. Previously, a year ago, this was not profitable for them. And overall, it was a much smaller part of their overall business. So, people are expecting this to become even larger going into the future here. So this is something to keep an eye on if you're looking at Tesla. Looking at Tesla's balance sheet, you'll see they have a very solid amount of cash right there. They have also been increasing their short-term investments. and their inventories, they have grown a little bit, as well as their prepaid expenses and other current assets. They've also added a bit to their property, plant, and equipment, and I'm pretty sure most of that is just their factories continuing to ramp up their production, so nothing very surprising there. Their total assets were at $86.8 million, which is up a bit from where it was the previous year. And their total liabilities are at $37.6 billion, also up a little bit, but overall still a very solid book value of almost $50 billion. Tesla's market cap is at $870 billion right now. Their stock had gone down for a number of months. It bottomed out around early January, and then it came back up to where it is today. Since they are profitable, they do have a price to earnings ratio of 75.7. They've also got price to sales of 10.4 and price to book of 17. Moving on to the fourth company on the list, we have EVgo, and they are fairly similar to Tesla in the sense that they own their chargers. They're not selling the hardware like ChargePoint and Wallbox do, so they're generating revenue from the sale of electricity. However, EVgo has more recently launched this Extend program where they do actually sell that charging hardware, but they do provide the maintenance, I believe, for these chargers if something goes wrong. Unfortunately, though, I believe this Extend program is still limited to just the partnerships that EVgo has. They've got a partnership with Pilot Flying J, they've got one with General Motors, and one with Nissan, I believe. So I think that's kind of the extent of this program for now. That might change in the future if it hasn't already. But still, their main business is just this owner-operator model where EVgo is the owner of these stations and they're just leasing the land that they're on and generating revenue from the sale of electricity. Looking at EVgo's income statement, you'll see they've had very good revenue growth over the past year, although their cost of revenues did grow even more. So again, their gross margins have been declining there. Now, they do have a pretty significant amount of depreciation that they list here, which isn't something you've seen on somebody like ChargePoint or Wallbox, and that's because EVgo is the owner of all of their chargers, so as those depreciate in value, they end up getting reported here on the income statement. Then after subtracting those costs, they've got a $41,000 gross profit, so it is an improvement over a year ago where they had a $600,000 loss. But, you know, they've also got these $42.7 million of operating expenses, which have increased from where they were a year ago pretty significantly, and, you know, an operating loss of $42.6 million. So it's still a long way to go until EVgo is profitable. Looking at their balance sheet, you'll see their cash has declined very dramatically from where it was at just the previous quarter. There's pretty much two main reasons for that. One of them is that they have continued buying property, plant, and equipment. Most of that is pretty much just their chargers. You know, these DC fast chargers, they're very expensive to build and install. So, you know, in order to continue growing their network, they have to continue building these chargers. And then the other source of it, of course, is that selling general and administrative expenses right there. So that's pretty much what's been draining EVgo's cash over this past quarter here. Despite that, EVgo still has quite a lot of total assets, $730 million worth, and total liabilities of $255 million. So their book value is right around $474 million. However, if you scroll down just a bit, you'll see this line right here, redeemable non-controlling interest, and what this is basically, you know, you've got EVgo and their subsidiaries all combined onto this one balance sheet, but those subsidiaries don't necessarily need to be 100% owned by EVgo. So there can be equity in these subsidiaries that EVgo has no ownership of. And that extra ownership gets reported right here on this line. And in EVgo's case, that is an awful lot. There's $1.5 billion worth of redeemable non-controlling interests. So basically that book value of $474 million, this gets subtracted from that. So the actual EVgo shareholders, they end up with total stockholders deficit instead of equity of just over $1 billion. EVgo's market cap is $1.26 billion, and their stock has been falling over the past year. Their price to sales ratio is just under 4 right now, and their price to book, Yahoo Finance shows it as basically non-existent, probably because The EVgo shareholder equity is negative $1 billion. And moving on to the fifth and final company on the list, we've got BLNK. And these days, BLNK is kind of an amalgamation of 4 different companies. One of those is BLNK itself, and the other 3 would be EB Charging, Blue Corner, and SemaConnect. If you see right here, like these are some of the original sort of BLNK chargers, but then these 2 right here are SemaConnect chargers. So they've just kind of got a whole slew of different hardware in here from all of these different companies that they've acquired over the years. So it's kind of a mixed bag here with BLNK these days. BLNK's main thing has historically been these public level 2 AC chargers, probably the most similar to ChargePoint out of the companies we've talked about here today as far as what products they're offering. But they are also getting into DC fast chargers. You'll see a fairly powerful unit right there, 240 kilowatts. Apparently that's coming soon. But they've also got a few other lower powered DC fast chargers down here as well. So they've got a pretty good variety of products that they've got. BLNK's business model is a bit unique from the previous companies we talked about here, since they choose to do both hardware ownership and hardware sales. So once we get to the income statement, you'll see that most of the revenue is coming from hardware sales, so similar to what ChargePoint and Wallbox do. But some of it is coming from hardware ownership, where they're generating revenue from the sale of electricity. And I've got that income statement pulled up right now, and you can see those hardware sales are at $16.4 million for the first quarter, and charging service revenue, basically selling the electricity for the chargers that they own, that came in at $2.9 million. So overall, a smaller part of their business compared to selling the hardware itself. BLNK's revenue growth was very good over the past year, although their cost of revenues also increased quite a lot, but not quite as much as the revenues did, so their margins have improved a little bit over this past year. They did have a gross profit of $4.5 million, but their compensation and general administrative expenses, those increased quite dramatically over the past year as well, so they ended up with a loss from operations of $30.8 million. Looking at their balance sheet, you'll see BLNK has a lot more cash than they had at the end of the previous quarter, and if you look at the cash flow statement, you'll see that it was supplied by issuing new shares. So, of course, we already saw the income statement. They're still not profitable and probably won't be for a while. So, if you're going to be owning BLNK stock, you should be expecting them to continue raising funds through either share dilution or taking on new debt. Now, since BLNK does own some of their chargers, they do have a lot more property and equipment reported here on the balance sheet than somebody like ChargePoint or Wallbox, but it's nowhere near the level that EVgo has for 2 reasons. One of them is that it's a smaller section of BLNK's business. Of course, most of the revenue we saw was coming from hardware sales, whereas most of EVgo's chargers are, ones that they're owning themselves. And then the second reason is that EVgo's chargers are DC fast chargers, so they're just a whole lot more expensive to build and install than BLNK, who is primarily just building and installing these level 2 AC chargers. BLNK's total assets were $441 million, and total liabilities were $107.3 million, so they had a pretty good book value of $334 million, but about $204 million of that was just from goodwill, primarily just from these 3 acquisitions of EB Charging, Blue Corner, and SemaConnect that they made over the past couple of years. So just keep that in mind if you're going to be owning BLNK Charging. BLNK's market cap is just under $400 million. Their stock has been falling over the past year like a lot of these other companies. Their price to sales ratio is just over 4, and their price to book is at 1.1. So those are the 5 charging companies I think are in the best position. Again, I don't think all of these are good investments. I just think they're in the best position compared to some other EV charging companies. Let me know what your thoughts were on my list, and feel free to share your own selection of the 5 charging companies you think are in the best position right now. But that's pretty much it for today's video. I've got lots of other videos on EV charging on my channel, so be sure to check those out, and I'll see all of you in the next video.